All right, welcome to another episode of Lucha, Undead, Reborn, season, this is 3 or 4, and this is the special. It's kind of like our ode to Stephen Colbert's Better Know a District. It's get to know the PWO. It's very special with Dylan Hales today. How you doing, Dylan?
I'm doing good. If my voice sounds weird or whatever, it's partially because I just woke up and partially because I have a cold. So,
yeah, that sucks. So in the same vein as I think it was about a month ago or so, we did an episode with Parv talking about David Bowie. We're going to get another kind of known in the wrestling journalist community guy in here talking about something else that they're passionate about other than wrestling. And Dylan, I always kind of picked up from you just little bits and pieces here that you seem to be into punk with a special kind of affinity for the anarchism and anarcho-punk stuff. I know that you mentioned that Waco is from your band, or a band that you were in that was called Waco.
Yeah.
And so just tell me a little bit about, I guess, that band and just your coming up in the punk scene when you were younger. You know what I mean? Like, what was it all about for you?
As a frame of reference, I'm 34 years old, and I've grown up in South Carolina. It's where I've lived for virtually my entire life. I'm from Charleston. And so my entry point for punk rock was relatively young, I think, by the standards of most people, in part because my parents came out of the 60s protest culture, and I already sort of had an interest in types of music that I don't think were necessarily as accessible for other people even before I found punk rock, in part because of my parents. So by like the summer of 91, maybe, or the fall of 91 is the first time I can ever remember listening to anything that would be categorized as punk rock. It would have been like a Bad Brains tape or maybe an MDC tape that somebody in my neighborhood had. And, by August 24th, 1992, which I'll never forget because it was the day after my 11th birthday, I went to my first ever punk rock show, which of course was a DIY do-it-yourself show out in the far-flung areas of Charleston, South Carolina, at a place called the Ladson Homemakers Club, which is very much in keeping with the DIY ethic. It's even more absurd than like the VFWs and American Legions or house show scene that a lot of people can imagine. So that's kind of how it started for me. Like I said, I wasn't even really a teenager yet at that point. I had friends who were skaters growing up. I was never a skater, but that always sort of kept me plugged into the underground cassette trading culture of the early 90s, which was pretty much the easiest way to find new bands or new ideas at that point if you were, an adolescent or a teenager. This was well before, MP3s or MP4s, or even before you could find a lot of, punk music or anything that was not on a major label in most record stores. I mean, there were some indie stores in town, although most of them didn't come until later. But they were, far-flung places that an 11-year-old was not going to be able to get to. So, I had an entry point pretty young, and I became pretty obsessed with it. I think anybody who's familiar with my pro wrestling rantings knows that I'm a pretty obsessive person when I'm into something. So if you can imagine a very young Dylan being obsessed with that, with something else, punk rock and really anarchism in general, would be two other things that I'm obsessed with. As far as the Waco pseudonym that follows my name on Twitter, I was in a band called Remnants of Waco in probably 96 to 99, I think, is when that band was doing stuff, which was around Charleston. We toured a little bit. We played out some, but we were mainly a regional band for whatever that's worth. I don't really care one way or the other. I have done pretty much every music project I've ever done was for my own purposes, not for anybody else's. And it was kind of a silly teen band, but definitely with politically themed lyrics, and a band that got in some trouble, and some venues didn't want to let us play just because of our name, and also because we would do stupid things live. But That was fun. That was one of many bands I've played in over the years, of varying degrees of quality and quote success, end quote. So,
what instruments did you actually play in that band, and in general, what do you play?
Well, I don't think it would surprise too many people to know, considering how much I like to talk, that I've always been a front man. Always the poor man's Jello Biafra with a microphone in his hand. It is true that I can sort of kind of play a little bit of bass, and on very rare occasions I've played bass live, mainly to fill in slots for somebody else, but I'm not any good at it. I can keep speed like with one bass line, and that's about it. So you can hide me. I sound like very, very early Germs. If you think
I'm kind of in the same boat as you. I essentially did the same thing in any bands I was ever in. It's like maybe I'd play something here and there, and I actually got good at doing like programming and stuff with a computer, but live performing with an instrument, not great.
Yeah, it's really weird because I've always liked to play live, but when you're in band, the older you get, the more you play. I haven't been in a band now for, I guess, 8 years or so. But the longer you're alone, what happens, regardless of, I shouldn't say completely regardless, but usually what happens is people, the musicians, the ones that are really musicians who are gifted musically, will gravitate more toward being people who want to be in the studio. They want to record. This especially, I think, became increasingly the case once digital technology allowed for that sort of to be democratized. You didn't have to go into a huge studio. You didn't have to save money to do it. And the front guys and the loudmouths are people like myself, frankly. I don't ever want to be in the studio because I enjoy playing live. So it sort of always created a conflict where I'm like, I don't want to, I'll do the studio. It's part of producing a record, but I don't really want to do it.
Well, it's a actually really interesting dichotomy that happens in the politics of every band, is that you want the musicians who know how to play their instruments really well, but the kind of people who become good at playing instruments are the kind of people who lock themselves away in their room and practice playing their instruments. But those aren't necessarily the people with the interpersonal skills and the ability to be entertaining on stage and to deal with talking to bookers and putting together shows, or talking to other bands and putting together tours. So it's kind of like you need both people in the band, but sometimes there ends up being kind of friction between the members, because it's like one person's like, you don't take the music seriously enough. And a lot of times you're kind of like, if you're the other side of it, you're going, yeah, but we wouldn't exist. We would just be playing in, instruments in your room, talking to each other while smoking pot, if I wasn't actually putting together shows. You know what I mean?
Oh, I do know what you mean. I guess the first time I ever helped to do a show, or whatever the hell term you want. I hate the term promoting when it comes to punk rock. It just sounds evil. But the first time I was ever involved on that end, I was probably like 13 years old. Even then at that stage, I was old enough to sort of realize kind of the things you're talking about, where it was a handful of people that sort of were actually putting together that part of it. And it doesn't mean that like the contributions of other people aren't important. I would absolutely never say that. But they're not the number of people who do it themselves in a do-it-yourself punk rock scene is always much smaller than people realize. Yes, part of it is showing up so that you have a sort of participatory base there, so it's not just you and your three buddies doing whatever. But as far as the people who are usually doing the shows, putting a zine together, organizing a tour, are doing some sort of gonzo campaign to make things more amusing, that's almost always a handful of people. And I don't care how big the scene is. It's almost always how it works.
No, yeah, completely. And I was eventually planning on getting to this, but you brought him up already, and I wanted to talk about your specific kind of being leaning towards the anarchist side of things. You brought up Jello Biafra, who's a guy who I personally look up to a lot. And I don't know if you're a big fan of Dead Kennedys or whatever, but where do you put him? Because I've always thought of Jello Biafra as kind of leaning more towards the socialist side. But where do you see him? I mean, his politics. Like, it's funny because I think Dead Kennedys are thought of as like a heavily political band, but realistically, they don't get really deep into the weeds and like policy wonk-ish, which not a lot of bands do. But their politics in their songs tend to be like, hey, it's not cool to murder brown people, but never like a lot of like, hey, there should be fair trade. You know what I mean?
No, I think part of that, I think, is just the time period they grew out of too, right? Because you're talking about a band that formed in the very late 70s and was pretty much over, I guess, by 86 or 87 with the Frankenchrist trial. So the time period was a lot different. I mean, this was not an era that is known for its mass movements. Not that there weren't any, there absolutely were, but it's not an era known for that particularly. So I think the issue end of what they were trying to project was not as significant, maybe at least in their minds, as the sort of absurdity that they were trying to peel back and expose to people, which is, of course, what you saw in Biafra's famous mayor campaign for San Francisco, which I guess was in '79. My own personal view of Biafra, I've seen him perform a spoken word a couple times. I always find him entertaining. My politics are not in line with his. He's much more in keep. I think this has definitely been the case over time with Biafra too. I should note. I don't know that I think this was always the case, but I think as time has gone on, he's become sort of increasingly sympathetic to the idea that if you just have an altruistic, benevolent case of regulators in power, the state's perfectly fine. Everything's going to work okay. That's always sort of been my criticism of socialism as a whole, is that I don't know that there's a lot of evidence to support that theory. And so for that reason, I don't really agree with a lot of his politics, but I do think he's an entertaining guy. I think he certainly is an egalitarian. I think his first principles are probably pretty good, which to me is where the sort of overlap comes when you're talking about anarcho-punks or people who are maybe more driven toward socialism of some sort, is I think the first principles are shared. I don't necessarily think the ideas beyond the first principles are that similar at all. But the first principles, which is sort of a sympathy for egalitarianism and a general belief that the maintenance of power as it currently exists is not good, I think are correct. I think they're shared beliefs. But I think once you get beyond that, it sort of starts to fall apart pretty quickly.
Well, what about the theory, and I don't even know who initially posited this, I've just heard it tangentially here and there, but that political leanings, political beliefs aren't necessarily a linear left to right thing, but more of kind of like a circular meet in the middle thing, where anarchism is actually the gap in between socialism and fascism in a way. And I don't know if you can posit or if you can say what you think about like an idea along those lines.
I actually think that is close to true. I don't like, generally speaking, I sort of am a little bit resistant to both the sort of linear way of thinking and the circular way of thinking, as it regards, where it would be on a timeline or something akin to a timeline. But I do think that's probably closer to an accurate statement, at least in the sense that I tend to agree with a lot of post-left anarchist theorists that anarchism really exists outside of the left-right paradigm. That's an overblown term that you hear like the Alex Joneses of the world try to co-opt for their own purposes. But I absolutely do believe that anarchism really doesn't fit within the sort of standard leftist vision of the world anymore. There certainly may have been a time when that was the case. I think it's fair to say that anarchism, generally speaking, at least in the sense that it's understood by most people, grew out of a few disparate left-wing movements. But at this point, I can't really say that I see it as particularly left. I don't see it as a right-wing movement either. Having said that, I'm also probably one of not a large number, but I'd say maybe a growing number of people who doesn't necessarily think that libertarianism, for example, is anathema to anarchism. I mean, a lot of people don't like it. I would never say I'm a capitalist. I'm not a capitalist. I don't like the idea of rule by capital, which at its base is what capitalism means. But do I believe in markets? Actually, yes.
Well, you have to, right? Like that's the the only real deciding factor in anarchism would be what is essentially a free market, would be the only real rule, or like rule of law. I guess the idea is that the rule of law in anarchism would be morality, just person to person morality, and the free market.
I would also say that depending on what sort of anarchist vision you believe in, there is a basis for some sort of what's the term I would want to use here? There's the basis for some sort of organizational principle that does not equate to the state. Now, there are, of course, anti-organization anarchists who will reject that wholesale. They'd say that's not the case. And I'm not entirely unsympathetic to them, but I think for the most part, very few anarchists will go far enough to say organization as a whole is something that we completely uniformly reject. First of all, I'm not sure that it's possible. But second of all, I just don't think that it's something that really fits in for many people who define themselves as anarchists. And of course, my anarchism is sort of an anarchism that is rooted in principles, in the sense that, you know, when people say things like, "Oh, that's not pragmatic," or "Oh, you're being ridiculous," pure philosophical mumbo jumbo, or whatever the hell. My position has always been that when you're talking about deep moral problems, deep social problems, deep political and cultural problems, the position that you should always start from is the position of principle. I think if you start from the position of pragmatism, you've already given up. At that point, it's already over. You start with principle, and if you're forced to support some sort of lesser evil out of absolute necessity because of the terms that you find yourself in, that's a choice you may have to make. But that's not an excuse for starting from the pragmatic principle. I think that's just a terrible way for anybody, regardless of their political philosophy, to live their life.
Well, see, that sounds like the kind of Wall Street 101 negotiating principles. And so even though you say you wouldn't follow capitalism, the idea that you start your kind of, I guess not debate, what am I trying to say? You start your negotiations from as far in the perfect ideal of what you want, rather than starting in the middle and then working your way closer and closer to the other side. You know what I mean?
Sure. Yeah.
So
and
I'm not, and I wasn't trying to like, gotcha. Oh, you're a capitalist. I'm just saying, like, those basic principles are used across the board for people who have any like monicum of intelligence when it comes to the idea of how you're going to negotiate. Like a Barack Obama getting into the White House and saying, "Oh, I'm going to intentionally govern from the middle to meet with the right as far over to the right as possible." Like you said, you've already lost, because you're essentially saying, I'm starting in the middle and the only place I have to go is further towards the other side.
Correct. I mean, I think one of the great myths of the Obama presidency is the idea that he ever wanted single-payer health care, for example. Now, regardless of whether you want single-payer or oppose single-payer, what I always point to is the idea of political capital sort of being a mythology that people latch onto because it makes them it makes it easier to excuse the failings of their preferred political team. So what happens is somebody will say, well, Obama never had the political capital to even try single-payer. Well, where was the political capital to pass TARP 1, for example? There wasn't a sentient being alive who supported that bill. You couldn't find anybody than – I mean, everybody from the far right to the far left to people in between. It was the most universally opposed bill of my lifetime, yet it still passed. Where was the political capital for No Child Left Behind? The Republican – base really opposed it. The left, for the most part, was very cynical about it at best, yet it passed. Political capital is just a term that sort of Washington insiders use as a cover to make sure that they can get away with whatever they want to without having to fight for anything that's difficult to achieve.
No, yeah.
I don't believe in it. I think it's a myth.
And you actually, as you're talking about that, I think a good example is Glass-Steagall, because there was honestly no one that really supported Glass-Steagall that much when it was passed, and then there was no one really supporting it when it was repealed. And it's kind of like, where's the political capital for both ends of the spectrum on the same bill? You know what I mean?
Sure.
And it gets done both times.
Yeah, and a lot of that too is just because Washington politics is it's a complete scam. I mean, most of these people don't believe anything they say. And the very, very small number that do are pushed so far out on the margins that they're immediately branded a kook or irrelevant, and they have no voice in the game whatsoever. My own personal view is that it's a scam in a variety of ways, just because of my rejection of the idea of the state wholesale. But even sort of accepting the idea of a state. If I were to do that as purely as a thought experiment, I can't imagine treating anything these people do seriously. I mean, it's so transparently bogus. It's hilarious. That's why I actually get great joy out of watching presidential campaigns, because it's effectively like watching pro wrestling, but with more outright fakery.
Yeah, exactly. And they're a little bit more polished on their promos in the presidential campaigns.
Yes.
It tends. But that's because they don't have to practice doing flips also. You can focus on just one end, like Dusty Rhodes, he was a really good promo because he didn't have to work out as much. But you brought up libertarianism, right? And I've heard a lot of people make the same argument as you. So the idea to me that you kind of were saying that maybe you're in the minority, I don't necessarily know. Maybe my circle is skewed towards people who kind of can see the underlying ethic of it, that libertarianism is kind of, in a way, it's like a right-leaning anarchism at times. The way that they kind of talk about states' rights in the same way that anarchists talk about like just communities' rights, as in saying like a village should govern itself without an actual built-up body or government over the top that's taking taxes and things like this. But I mean, this is part of why you're on here as well. I don't know if you are familiar with Mark Clare. He's on some of the podcasts on the PWO network as well, but he hosts a libertarian podcast, and I listen to that show religiously. I think they put out 3 episodes a week, and I listen to that religiously, not being a libertarian myself, but just because I like to hear all sides of things. And sure. I don't know, do you come down on that politically? What do you listen to politically from the other side, or is there anything that you listen to politically from the other side? I guess there's not a lot of authoritarian podcasts that exist.
You'd be surprised if you get into like deep into white nationalist culture. You can hear some very disturbing things, and I'm not just talking about the Trump campaign. There is, when as far as listening, I really don't.
Watching.
I don't listen to a lot because I'm a big time reader. I have about 4,500 books in my house, and I'm somebody who's read everything from like Bastiat, who of course is in many ways the godfather of libertarianism, depending on who you ask. So I've read Bastiat, I've read Rothbard. In fact, I quite like Rothbard. I think his his decision to align himself with certain people in politics was ridiculous, but I think many of his arguments are actually pretty consistently anarchist, and I don't think his vision of capitalism necessarily is as what's the word I'm looking for? Pernicious or vulgar as one might believe. I'll read things like the various libertarian websites that are out there. They're so varied that you can't even – I mean, like somebody like Stefan Kinsella, for example, who I think is one of the better critics of intellectual property out there as a libertarian. I read him a good bit. He's quite good. I actually listen to Tom Wood's podcast probably more than any political podcast, just because Tom does a pretty good job of sort of synthesizing the general sense of what's going on in libertarianism and putting it on the airwaves. Again, I don't agree with Tom on a lot of things. I think he's, like a lot of libertarians, I think he's way too invested in the idea that corporations are an inevitability and a positive good, and that they just would exist in a true free market. I actually don't agree with that. I think if corporations had to stand up to true free market principles, most of them would collapse overnight.
Right, or if they were forced to like kind of account for the externalities and the external costs that they create, then sure. There's no way they'd exist.
I mean, look at this. That's a great way of putting it. I mean, look at the state highway system, for example. That's all externalized cost onto taxpayers. If Walmart can't exist without that. I mean, There's no way. So that's just one example. I was
thinking more of like pollution and stuff like that. If they had to account for that as well.
That's a great example too. I mean, you can find a litany of them. I do enjoy Kevin Carson, and generally speaking, the Center for a Stateless Society website is one of my favorite websites. It's probably, I don't want to say it's more in line with my thinking than anybody else, because they tend to have they tend to do what a lot of libertarians do. And many of the people at that site, I think, would probably refer to themselves as market anarchists, to be fair. But Probably the biggest distinction between me and libertarians is libertarians, and I realize I'm saying this talking into my iPhone using Skype, but libertarians have what I regard as a very naive belief in technology as the great savior. While I am not a Zerzanite, I'm not an anarcho-primitivist, I am somewhat sympathetic to their critique of technology and the idea that we're well along the entropy bandwagon at this point, and that the more complex an institution gets, whether it be a technological node or a large business or a large corporation or a large government, the more inefficient it becomes, the more flaws break out, and eventually it's going to lead to outright chaos and destruction. I don't know that that's a universal principle I hold, but it's pretty close to one that I hold. So I'm a little bit suspicious of the idea that technology is going to usher in a wonderful new age and everything's going to be wonderful once we can all download ourselves into a hive mind like Ray Kurzweil wants or whatever. but that's sort of a broader critique of libertarianism that goes beyond any principles they have when it comes to markets and things of that nature. When it comes to basic arrangement of society, I think a lot of people who would identify themselves as left libertarians are pretty close to me. I'd say very close. Probably the biggest difference is I don't have any real problem, and I don't see any innate superiority in political economy in general. And what I mean by that is I don't necessarily look at things and say, well, here's an economic rule that everybody has to follow at all times. I don't think that's how the world works. And I think that there's even within market anarchism, I think there's a strain that sort of clings to this idea of markets as the be all and end all, and this is obviously the right way. Well, I don't think there is a right way.
And as someone I'm very passionate about economics. As I say, I consider myself a socialist, so economics kind of go hand in hand with that. And listening to the other side of people who really buy into the economic theory, and then there's becoming a greater movement for the concept of what they call homo economicus, which is like the idea that what the principles of economics account for is the person who makes all of their decisions based on what is economically sound, as opposed to the fact that most human beings don't make those choices. So there's actually a new wave of study that is like applied economics to real life situations and seeing how people actually react and what they do. And a lot of times, the market isn't what's driving the forces. What's driving the forces a lot of times is personal decisions, people's lives, what makes sense for them. And I can attest to that myself. I mean, right now I'm having issues because I have a pet in my house. My pet in my apartment costs me extra money every month for my landlord, right? Well, if this was just a market decision, I wouldn't have a pet then. Because, money, and it's not worth the extra money to have her. But because it's a kind of a quality of life choice, and I'm saying, well, I enjoy having her, then I'm going to spend the extra money to keep her. If that makes kind of sense in the context?
Yeah, actually, one of my biggest criticisms of Marx and von Mises on the opposite end, and I've read them both, but one of my biggest criticisms of both is that I think the sort of I think materialism as a whole is really flawed. I think this idea that you can pin everything down to pure economic motives, I understand why people say that. And I do think the Austrian school of libertarianism is right to argue that, for example, that economics has nothing to do with math. I think that's actually dead on correct. But that doesn't mean that economics is a totalistic, all-consuming thing. That doesn't mean that we're completely wedded to economics in every facet of our life at all times. I think that just ignores the human dimension too much. Now, to be fair, many Austrians would probably say, well, we never say that. No, but I think it's consistently implied in a lot of what they write. But even more than that, I think it's something that is sort of consistently viewed as being in what they write by people who are new to that subject. So it becomes sort of this economics become not just central, but almost the whole thing. It becomes, how do we weigh this in terms of raw economics? That's not how people are at the end of the day.
Yeah, and it's kind of, economics is somewhat becoming fashionable now, it seems, like the economic study, and it's almost being deified the way science was for years, where it's kind of like people would be like, no God, science. Now it's kind of turning into no God, economics, or I guess no science, economics. But it's the new thing, and you're right, like you said, the concept of economics doesn't involve any math, and the actual, like I said, real applied economics is very interesting when you're kind of doing basically socioeconomics and you're studying people based on their actions, not really on their numbers, and kind of applying it to where they are as a person, their demographics and all that, combined with what choices and decisions do they make, is a lot more interesting topic. And as you kind of dig into that whole ball of wax, you realize, I think it was basically in my physics class, and it was when I kind of realized something very interesting about the universe. Was my physics teacher basically said, you can just assume that when you're doing a certain calculation, that entropy constantly increases over time. And it's not considered a law of physics, but it's considered kind of like a theory that is essentially law, that entropy is constantly increasing. Well, yeah, if you look at socioeconomics, the decisions that people make, you can see that it's not patterned. It doesn't follow kind of any kind of rules, and it is just slowly becoming more and more chaotic over time. But this, I feel like we're getting really into the weeds here already, and we were supposed to be talking about punk music a little bit. It's a lot of fun already. I definitely want to know what anarcho-punk bands really inspired you to move towards specifically anarchism. And then the elephant in the room for me when it comes to this music, being someone who identifies as a socialist, it's going to come down to Crass, who I've heard people refer to as an anarcho band. But to me, I've always seen kind of everything about them being more socialist. Even the fact that they kind of were created in what was essentially like a commune, you know what I mean? In a house where everyone was kind of working together and putting all of their funds in together. And it can be seen as possibly an anarchist utopian society, but to me, it came across more socialist. So let's start out with bands that really influenced you into going towards anarchism as your, I guess, preferred method of existence. I don't even know how to describe someone who considers themselves an anarchist, and then we'll work into the Crass conversation, because I really have to talk to you about that.
Okay, so I think I mentioned earlier that MDC was one of the first tapes I remember hearing, and I would say MDC was probably pretty important to me when it came to the idea that people could actually believe this stuff. And what I mean by that is, this sounds really snotty and even absurd, but I think I kind of always was an anarchist, in the sense that I always sort of, even as a little kid, thought things were dumb, like that you were supposed to believe in. But I didn't have any ideological footing for that. My mother is sort of a Dorothy Day Tolstoyan Christian anarchist. So I don't know that she would use those exact terms, but I don't think she would shy from them either. My dad's basically a socialist. He's basically like you. But the point is, there was already.
That's why I like him so much.
The point is, there was already some sort of, there's some sort of propensity for radical thought that was there that I was born into. But MDC was really big for me because I found them so young. It's weird because when people ask me like who my favorite bands are, I don't think I would ever mention MDC, but they're a band that I found when I was really, really young, and maybe the first band where I actually was able to say people are allowed to think about this. This is like an idea that you can express and people won't think you're insane. I think going from there's a lot of bands that to one degree or another held interest for me. As far as influence goes, it's really tough to peg down. I mean, like I love Subhumans, for example, but they're not necessarily a band that I feel like, they influence my politics a ton, which is odd because they're pretty clearly fall within the sort of anarcho milieu, for lack of a better term. I don't know if I would say that there was any single band where I had like a eureka moment. However, and this is odd because I think they're probably more socialist than anarchist, but Propagandi's How to Clean Everything release came out and their previous Recess Records stuff came out when I was like super becoming huge into punk rock, and it was like totally consuming and taking over my life on like a daily basis. So that record is one that always sort of jumps off the page to me because it links up with me in time, as far as like when I really became completely invested in all this stuff. I was already listening to other stuff before, like MDC and Subhumans and things of that nature. But Propagandhi was kind of the band where like I was there when they were getting big, if that makes sense.
Yeah. No.
And so that sort of became like a hub for me. And then going from there, a lot of the Abolition bands that Kent McClard put out and the Heart Attack fanzine, which of course all California stuff, starting in the mid 90s going through to maybe the early 2000s, they had varying degrees of sort of anarchist and socialist themes, bands like Torches to Rome, for example. But that was a hugely influential sound to me, and also a sort of a hugely influential way of doing business, because I do think that sort of communal spirit and the DIY ethic can be read as anarchist or socialist depending on your leanings. I think, and I'll let you intro the crass topic here, but I think partially that depends on the lens that you want to view it with.
No, yeah, exactly. And as I was in the middle of talking about that, which is something that I had been amped up to bring up in general, just because to me, I've always been a fan of crass politically, but not as much musically. I do like their music, obviously, but I'm not like a huge fan. But politically, I've always, like I said, thought of them as socialists. And then over the years, as I saw more people kind of relate them to the anarcho thing, I was just like, that it just doesn't make sense to me, really. And then turn around, and as I'm in the middle of kind of prefacing this conversation, as I'm saying it, I'm like, you know what? It does kind of go both ways, and you can see it either way. But as you were talking now, I just thought, like, God, who am I to be like, well, you have to defend every band that you've ever liked, and you have to only listen to bands to fit with what you politically believe in. They have to talk only about your because I'm like, I mean, when I was in middle school and high school, to begin with, when I got into punk, I'm like obviously super into social issues and always have been. And some of my favorite bands to go see or just listen to were like party punk, beer punk type bands that had no message and were just about drinking and getting high. You know what I mean? And like that was never me as a person, but I enjoyed listening to that. I just liked the music. So maybe you don't have to always kind of I can't even finish what I'm saying. Maybe you don't always have to prove that the bands that you listen to politically coincide with exactly how you see the world. But let's get into crass. What do you think about them? Do you see them as a preeminently anarchist band? Do you not see them that? Do you even see them as important? Because I know that some people don't think of them as even that important of a band. To me, I think they were, because in a way they were important at the time artistically, and then they kind of show that years later something that was that niche can kind of still become mainstream. You see American Apparel, or I don't even know what fucking company, was selling a crass jacket recently. Within the past 5 years, they were selling some leather jacket for $200 or $300 with a crass patch on the back. So it just kind of shows that you can build a legacy out of nothing that will stand the test of time. And so let's just get into it. What do you think? Where do you see them politically, and what do you think of them even as a band?
Well, I think in terms of influence, Crass and Dead Kennedys are probably 1A and 1B when it comes to bands that probably influenced a lot the larger idea of a political punk ethic. You can argue about where they fall on a within what paradigm they are in or whatever, but I think generally speaking, those two are pretty clearly 1A and 1B. Now, part of that might be my age, because I'm actually old enough to remember people who were like had seen Crass and were like super, super into them in the early days. I guess they formed in the mid 80s, 83, 84.
Yeah.
So some of my friends growing up were people who were like familiar with Crass from the beginning. So that's part of it. But still, I absolutely think that they're important. I think it's kind of ridiculous to argue that they're not important. It would be like, to use another punk example, it would be like arguing that Jawbreaker wasn't an important band because Vagrant Records existed. So what? Jawbreaker started all that shit to a large degree. Of course, they're an important band, but as far as where they fall, like within a, like if you're trying to look at them purely on political terms, I think they're probably anarcho-communist, and there is a such thing. I mean, I think, living on a commune, unless it's a completely state-run and funded apparatus, does not mean that you're rejecting the principles of anarchism. The principles of anarchism allow for all sorts of organization within one's daily life. I don't think that, in fact, I would argue that maybe the key to anarchism is understanding the significance of your daily life and living it as closely to how you'd like as possible, given the circumstances that you're in. So, to me, being in a communal setting does not necessarily, in fact, I would argue in most cases, it explicitly rejects the state, because it's the state that tells you this is how you have to live, this is the regulatory apparatus by which you must abide, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Going further, I think the fact that Crass and others sort of became the bands that sort of became synonymous with space playing as much as playing clubs or venues or whatever, I also think is really critical, because the reality is that for the most part, if you're playing at a punk rock show that's a true DIY show, whether it's a space owned and operated for art, which a lot of the places that Crass played were, or it's a VFW hall or whatever, what you're really doing is completely rejecting the state wholesale, whether you want to admit it or not. Because if you've got 300 people packed into a room where the fire code says there's supposed to be 50, and you're playing this loud, aggressive music and completely unsupervised, doing effectively whatever you want within the confines of that space, that's anarchism. That's what that is. Is it the same thing as storming on the Pentagon and burning it to the ground? Of course not. And for the record, I'm not condoning that.
Yeah, right. Well, I mean, anarchism is terrorism. I don't think anyone would say it. But some people would probably conflate the two.
But my point is that I think you can. I think Crass was a very significant band in expressing the idea that you can reject the state not just through your lyrics, not just through the clothes you're wearing or whatever, but also through doing things in a sort of anti-state fashion, or frankly, just ignoring the state and doing whatever you want. I mean, that sort of cultural subversion and secession, I actually think is really important. I think for the most part, it's the most that people can do. And I do see Crass as being a band that was pretty well invested in that culture, and pretty, along with Subhumans, for take another example, pretty good at sort of adhering to that sort of philosophy and trying to live it in their daily life. So I would say that they may have been both anarchist and socialist in terms of if you're trying to. I don't think it's an either or proposition. Just because I'm not a socialist for a variety of reasons doesn't mean that you can't be a socialist and an anarchist at the same time. In fact, I think you really can. And in fact, even many of the individualist anarchists of the American strain, people like Benjamin Tucker and Lysander Spooner and people of that nature, toyed with the idea that they were socialist when they would do some of their writing. And these are people who are considered libertarian godfathers today by much of the Mises.org crowd. Yet those people often would refer to themselves as sort of like market socialist, which sounds contradictory, but I'm not sure that it is. It's much more difficult to answer, I think, than just say you're in column A or you're in column B.
Yeah, I mean, I've kind of toyed with the idea that theoretically socialism is more of an economic policy and not necessarily a government policy or like authoritative policy, as to say that the government has to follow a socialist edict to be a socialist government. They could just have a socialist economic policy, similar to like a capitalist. So basically, in some ways, it's like the ends of the spectrum are socialism versus capitalism, not necessarily socialism versus libertarianism or anarchism or anything along those lines. So I guess they can go in line with each other, just like, you can be whatever, a mix of two things from two different realms of study or realms of decision making. So you would say that your preferred government is none, right? Anarchism, that would be the basic way to put it. There would be no kind of governing body.
No state apparatus. Yeah,
Okay.
I prefer the term state apparatus to governing body, because then you get into arguments like, well, isn't a family a government? Which is just, whatever.
Yeah. No. Well, okay. None of us in this conversation are assholes, so that's not going to happen. So then,
For yourself, Tim.
well, that's true. So if we go from there, what would be your preferred economic policy then if you don't think socialism? Because obviously you made it clear that you don't believe in socialism. So what would you believe then in? You don't believe in capitalism, you don't believe in socialism. What would you believe in for economics? Or maybe you don't believe in the idea of economics. I can accept that as well, that there should be maybe no monetary fund and we work on just a basic person-to-person free market barter system. I don't know. What do you see?
Well, I do think that there is a tendency to fetishize economics. And I say that as somebody who reads a lot of it and enjoys studying it myself. So I'm guilty of it myself. But I do think there's a tendency to sort of treat it as like the be all and end all, which we kind of talked about earlier.
Right.
Having said that, first I should say that I don't wholesale reject socialism in the sense that, like, if you're like the idea of like this, say the kibbutz, for example, in Israel. Something like that, I don't wholesale reject that. I don't see anything wrong with that as an organizing principle for daily life or subsistence or whatever. What I do reject is the tendency within socialism to sort of concentrate power in a greater body politique than the individual. I'll just put it that way. I think that the tendency there almost always ends up bad. I also think, generally speaking, socialism has a very dangerous relationship with the regulatory state, and by that I'm not condoning like corporations polluting the earth. Oh, you're against regulate, blah blah. No, but for example, if the regulatory state existed, or regulatory practice existed within the way that many socialists view it, there would be no DIY punk rock because all those spaces would be closed down under OSHA violation. So, well, yeah, I think. That's so I just want to get that out of the way to make clear sort of what my objections to a sort of general socialist economics are. Having said that, a lot of what I believe would probably be defined as socialist by many other people. I just don't really see that. For example, I agree with both Marx and, again, Mises, to be fair, that primitive accumulation was really the great sin. And by that I mean, when the state how did all these people get their land? Well, the state gave it to them. They chose winners and losers, and they gave it away. There's been a historic policy of that carried all over Europe, most famously in England with the Acts of Enclosure, but also all throughout the United States with the big giveaways to the railroad interest, among other groups. I mean, these are giveaways. This is the state literally giving land away to corporate interest and creating a nexus that thereby controls things. My view is that primitive accumulation is the great sin. So if you can eliminate the sort of fallacy that lies at the root of primitive accumulation, which is the idea that possessing something on paper means you possess it in fact, you sort of eliminate a lot of the problems that come with modern economics. To that end, I'm pretty close to a mutualist in the sense that I think squatting is a good thing. I think defining property rights based on occupancy and use, for example, is a much more reasonable way. By the way, that was the way property rights were defined both in the Western and Eastern tradition all the way up until the Industrial Revolution. So this is hardly a novel concept. This is the way it was done for almost all of human history. But to me, those are pretty sound ways to eliminate a lot of the economic problem. Now, some people would say, well, that sounds like socialism because you're talking about taking and giving to others. Well, not really. I think what we've seen, for example, in parts of Detroit where places were just abandoned wholesale, and people just walked in and said, well, you know what, this is a place and it exists, and we're going to turn the water on, and we're going to turn it into a small business, or we're going to turn it into a functioning squat. And it's done pretty well for some people. You always hear the horror stories about Detroit, but you don't hear about a lot of those positive things that have happened there. And I think that that's a model that probably people should look at going forward, is sort of taking back these spaces that effectively were given away, and given away not just on the. I'm not talking about unfairly. I'm talking about a state. The state comes in and says, we're giving this to X. Well, who the fuck is the state to give anything to anybody? I mean, like, they don't have any rights. No state in human existence has ever had any rights. Those rights go to people. So I really, to me, looking at things like occupancy and use as a governing philosophy for ownership, and also rejecting intellectual property rights, which I think are absolutely terrible and destructive things that don't really exist anyhow. I think those two things, you did those sort of things, I think a lot of the economics issues will work themselves out, because people will be able to choose, do I want to live in a system that's like, say, a kibbutz or a co-op, or do I want to live in an area that's maybe more geared toward outright market exchange along what we, I think, erroneously call a capitalist model?
Well, yeah, and the idea of borders, just anecdotally, if I kind of say for myself, in my profession, I have a state license and I have a national license. But the reciprocity from state to state is not the same. So if I decide to move to another state, because let's just say I wanted to go to Oregon or Portland or New York or anywhere, because just personally it seems like that's a community that I fit in better, I have to still then apply for licensing in their state. I have to possibly pass tests. I have to do all these other things. So kind of if you absolved that concept and you based things, like you said, just on occupancy, and there's no ownership, and people can just kind of transiently move from place to place, I'd have a lot more freedom. But then where's the protection? Like, this feels awkward. This is really awkward for me to say, because I feel like I'm making the like libertarian argument, which I don't agree with at all. So I'm trying to play devil's advocate to you, and it's like super difficult for me because I don't believe what I'm saying. But like, where's the protection for people? And I understand that, as I brought up earlier, there's the concept of that the community governs itself. If the idea, if there's a pedophile, the community will take care of it in its own way. But when I come in and I do a job that people's lives are at risk at times, if I decide to show up to a community and just start doing the job and then people die, sure, I'll lose the job after people die, but people still died. So how do you protect from stuff like that?
Well, first of all, I would note that the libertarians themselves sort of implicitly agree with what I just said, even though they believe in a different form of property rights. I mean, they think contracts are everything, regardless of whether or not one person one party that's to the contract is, innately evil by their own definition. So I think that is telling. Having said that, even Rothbard himself was in favor of the homesteading principle after a certain amount of time. He wrote about this at length during his flirtation with the left in the late 60s and early 70s. So, you can, using Rothbard's own words, of course, I'm talking about Murray Rothbard, who's really the intellectual godfather of radical anarcho-capitalism in the United States. So I don't think it's inconsistent with Rothbard's vision. So from a purely libertarian perspective, I think you can actually argue for everything I just said to varying degrees or another, because after all, if you're a libertarian and you believe that the state is a gang of thieves writ large, to use Rothbard's language again, the odds are that you don't think somebody that got land via or property via a state grant or through association with the state or whatever is really legally entitled to that land if you're willing to flesh it out and be serious with your principles. When it comes to things like public safety or sort of day-to-day maintenance of disputes, for lack of a better way of viewing it, I think those are issues that are going to have to come up on the community basis. I don't think there's a catch-all answer to that. Having said that, I mean, look at what we have in the United States today. I live in Charleston, South Carolina. I live in one of the poorest areas in the entire state, maybe the poorest area in the entire state. There was 2 acts of horrific violence in this state that occurred just last year. The Walter Scott murder by a police officer, and the shooting at the Emmanuel AME Church. My point in all this is the police don't do a very good job of protecting people as it is. The sort of, the idea that things would be horrifyingly worse without sort of state agents roaming around and enforcing whatever arbitrary policies were decided on any moment. I think for many communities in the United States, that's just comical. I've said this before, but my grandmother, who just passed away last year, was a Southern Baptist, very much a Southern belle. For personal reasons, she was not nearly as conservative, for lack of a better term, on social issues as most people who ascribe to those beliefs. But the point is, she sort of had a belief in law and order and authority and all that. And by the last few years she was alive, she would tell me that anytime she saw a police officer, she was terrified. Well, what does that tell you? I mean, this is a woman with a beehive hairdo in her 80s. What possible reason would she have to be afraid of the police? A white woman in the South with a beehive hairdo. Come on. I don't think these institutions, whether they be sort of the police themselves or the sort of social, I guess what I would argue is you can't take nobody is entitled to a job or to a sort of protection racket to protect them from competition. No one's entitled to that. Having said that, my suspicion is that for most people, if you're not a complete piece of shit, you're going to end up having a protection or being favorable enough with your neighbors where you're not going to have to worry too much about those sort of things. I think the people that are in real danger of having their property seized if they leave town for 3 weeks under the vision I'm talking about, or whatever, would be the people who are assholes and no one likes. And while some might say, well, they're still entitled to their property, we have a Bill of Rights to protect ourselves from those sort of things, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's all true. However, if I'm looking at alternatives on a scale of what's worse or what's better, I prefer a system where maybe 1 out of every 5,000 assholes gets booted out of his property than one where people in my neighborhood are getting shot and beaten by the police all the time.
Yeah, I can't argue with that. I mean, me personally, just speaking for myself, that's why I don't ever go on vacation, is because I know that I'm an asshole. So if I leave long enough, the people might take my property. But yeah, no, I mean, like you're talking about your grandmother, and it's similar here. I mean, I live in Southern California. I live in Los Angeles, California. The police out here are obviously like scarier than things that you see in horror movies to the average person. I'm a white male in my early 30s soon, and luckily it hasn't been as bad because I haven't been regularly driving for the past couple years. But for my entire life, if I was driving and I saw a cop, I was scared to death. And I don't break the law. I don't do anything illegal. I barely drink. I don't do any illicit drugs. I don't commit any crimes or felonies. I don't steal. And why am I constantly afraid of the police? And so, yeah, that point is definitely very valid. But At the same time, you could argue that the reason why I'm afraid of the police is because even though, yes, they make mistakes, they are also out there making sure that everyone's afraid of them, so much afraid that they're not out committing crimes. I know that that's not 100% true, but it may dissuade some. That's the slippery slope that I feel like I have to cut us off on, because when I'm making the devil's advocate argument for the idea that as soon as there's no police, everyone would run rampant raping and pillaging, I just feel like I need to take a shower after that point. So, Adrian, do you have any questions for Dylan? Because I know you've been kind of quiet there, and I know that these topics are something that's not necessarily in the breadth of your kind of your forte. But if there's anything in particular you'd like to ask him about, go for it now.
No, not necessarily. I mean, I this has been very fascinating. First of all, I honestly didn't really know much about what anarchy and punk music and all that represents, but this has been a good, I guess, way to learn about it more. So, and I don't really have anything, to be honest, Tim. So,
okay,
you could have at least asked who my favorite sci-fi writer was. And I would have said Ursula Le Guin for the record, which as an anarchist shouldn't surprise anyone.
Well, Adrian, ask him something within your wheelhouse. I mean, you went to film school. Is there any kind of anything like that? Anything at all?
Well, okay. Well, I will say this. Where do you sort of see? Because this is obviously going to be obviously already is a huge election year. So where do you kind of see things going as far as this year's election? Like, who do you think is gonna who might end up winning the Democratic ticket and the Republican ticket, and how do you think that's gonna go? Like, do you follow that at all, or what? What do you? Think?
I follow it very closely because I find it. But when you don't have a dog in the fight, it actually becomes really entertaining in a different way. So,
well, yeah, it's like watching football or the Super Bowl when you don't give a fuck about which team wins.
Correct. My own view, I will say this. I think the scariest one is – people say the scariest one is Trump. I don't agree with that.
Not at all. Yeah.
I think the scariest one is Marco Rubio. To me, Rubio strikes me as the sort of bloodthirsty lunatic who wishes the United States was at war with every country on earth at all times.
Well, no, I see it the other way I see it the same way, but with Cruz. From the stories that I've heard about him, he sounds like a complete sociopath who has no concept of interpersonal relationships.
Oh, there's no question.
Yeah, so I'm scared of him as well.
I think they're really. I would actually argue, and I'm inclined to agree with sort of what you're getting at there, Timothy, in the sense that I think Trump is the least scary of the three Republicans with a chance at this point, because Trump doesn't believe in anything, and I think he will gravitate toward the center. And yes, he's got some scary rhetoric. Yes, he's run an explicitly white nationalist campaign, which, by the way, I find that morally repugnant. But if I'm in the Republican Party in 2016, it's actually genius politically, because if Romney had just gotten, I think, 3 or 4 more % of the white vote in 2012, he'd be the president right now if it was dispersed across the right states. So from a purely political perspective, this shows how evil politics is, I might add. The Republican actually has a vested interest in running a white nationalist campaign, because it's easier for them to get 3-4% of the white vote than it is to get 25% of the black vote,
especially
of the Hispanic vote.
When the racist conservative core of the Republican Party feels disenfranchised by the common Republican nominee who goes, yeah, I'm Christian, yeah, this and that, but then when they get into office, they never actually do anything that's right. That's that side. So
So I mean, it's really, it's disturbing. Certainly, I'm not condoning it, but I think that's actually good politics, which again shows you how evil politics are. I think Trump is going to win because I think it's on the Republican side, because I think it's too late to coalesce around Rubio. I think they've waited too long. I think the only way Trump loses the Republican Party nomination at this point is if he self-destructs in a spectacular fashion, and up to this point he's managed to avoid that. I'm not even sure what that would entail at this point. I mean, he'd have to literally tattoo the Stormfront logo on his face or something. I don't even know if it's possible. Over on the other side, I think Hillary's going to win. I think she will probably put the nail in the coffin today as we record this on Saturday. It's voting day in my state for the Democrats, the primary. And I think she's going to beat Bernie fairly handily here. And I think from there it's going to be tough for Bernie to get any real momentum. I think he's going to do better He's already done better, but I think he's going to do better in a lot of places than people suspect, and he may even win some more states, but I don't think it's going to matter. I think he'll stay in it all the way to the convention anyway, because I think he's running a campaign about ideas, and he should stay in it to the convention. And then in the general, it's going to come down to two unlikable candidates that the majority of Americans really don't like at a visceral level in Trump and Hillary. And if you ask me to say who I think is going to win right now, I would say Hillary Clinton. But what I would say that Trump has going for him is Trump in a battle between unlikables. I think even people who don't like Trump find him entertaining. People who don't like Hillary just want her to go away. And I think that could be a major, major problem for her if her campaign is not perfectly crafted. But sitting here in this moment, I would argue that Hillary is going to win the presidency.
Well, national polls right now show Hillary versus Trump heads up, that Trump wins by like 2 or 3 points. So, but that's very, very far out. And you know what I mean? That says nothing about after they finally do start campaigning heads up. But yeah, right now, favorably, Bernie Sanders is the only one who, in a national poll, in a runoff against either three of the Republicans, would actually win.
I'll be honest. I personally, and I'm not a Sanders supporter, but my own personal view is that the Democrats would be much better off nominating Sanders in the general. And I know that's a view that's considered contrary by all the political insiders. But I think in a year where the campaign is about anti-establishment politics, I think it's a terrible mistake to nominate a completely inside the Beltway establishment hack in Hillary Clinton. Having said that, I also think that, a lot of people will vote for her because she's a woman. I realize that sounds like MRA douchebaggery, and I hate even saying it and having it come out of my mouth. But I also know for an absolute fact that there were a lot of people that voted for Obama because he was black. I don't. Again, I sound like Trump here, but this is something that I heard routinely during that election cycle, where people would literally say to me, I'm voting for him because he's black and we need a first black president. I mean, literally, that would be like the entire argument. So I think that, and I don't think, and the people who are not inclined to vote for Hillary because she's a woman, because they're sexist, weren't going to vote for a Democrat anyway. So I think the sort of this historic moment of the Obama presidency and the potential Hillary presidency, because of the first nature of having a woman in office, high office, will probably increase turnout with groups that maybe wouldn't have turned out otherwise. And I think that could be what tips it in her favor. But I do think that Bernie would be a safer bet, to be honest, versus Trump. Right. I just think in the year of anti-establishment politics, the anti-establishment alternative to the anti-establishment guy on the right is who you should logically go for. The biggest knock against Bernie, I think, really is his age. I think I've said all along that if Elizabeth Warren had run and not Bernie, I think she would have won the nomination easily, because she would have had sort of the political messaging of Bernie, but also she would have been somebody that we could look to as a historic first woman to take the office. So I think she probably would have won the nomination rather easily.
Well, to hit all the quadrants, you should probably just say people won't vote for Bernie because he's Jewish. But no,
he hasn't played that up. He hasn't played that up.
Of course he hasn't. But he would technically be the first Jewish president. That's right. That's one thing. But no one cares about that, really, because I mean, half of the people who obviously wouldn't vote for Bernie anyways are going to say that, 3/4 of the presidents we've already had are all secret Jewish. So, so that won't matter in that regard. But, Elizabeth Warren is a good argument, but I've always kind of conceded, being someone who's actually been a fan of Bernie's and a supporter of Bernie's for as long as I've known about politics, basically, which is kind of crazy. It was really insane for me. It was kind of like an indie band or an underground wrestler getting popular in the mainstream when people were starting to talk about Bernie. Is that Elizabeth Warren just doesn't have the same passion and the same just I don't know how to put it, the knowledge base. And it sounds bad, like trying to say she's not as smart. I'm not saying she's not as smart, but Bernie can pull from almost anywhere in a moment, it seems. When he's conversationally talking, he'll have references and data points and things that are all correct, just at the tip of his brain at all times. And he's got a certain amount of passion and fervor to the way that he talks that Warren, I don't know if she could match. But I think you are right that politically she would probably be a better opponent against Hillary than Bernie is.
Yes, because the what Bernie has run into is, there's been a fissure within the left for a while between the and by left I mean primarily left liberalism for a while, where one camp sort of has lined up and said identity politics are really critical. And these are the things that are really central to our governing philosophy. They're central to the way we look at the world. The sort of intersectionalist moment, I think would be the way to describe it. The other side is sort of the old school class war politics of the left, and I'm not using that as a pejorative for the record. That sort of comes out of the unionist mentality that used to form the sort of backbone of the left in the country for years and years and years. And I think they've sort of been at odds with each other for quite a while. I mean, you could see those odds as far back as the Port Horn statement that SDS made on their founding in the early 1960s. But I think what Warren would do would be effectively to synthesize those two traditions into one person. And for that reason, I think she would have been a stronger candidate than both Bernie and Hillary. And I say that again as somebody who has absolutely no dog in this fight.
Right. Yeah, just looking at it from the outside, it's a very interesting election, and I probably won't vote for actually anyone. I probably just won't vote at all, unfortunately, because it's tough, and I guess it's the anarchist stance, but I'm in California, so I kind of know who's going to win no matter what for our votes. It's just always kind of goes that way. And by that I mean Trump will probably actually win California, even though I think a lot of people don't think that that's true. That's Californians love us some fucking loudmouth Republican actors. Just look at our governors and just look at Ronald Reagan.
Just look at Orange County.
Well, yeah, exactly. So there's one question I wanted to ask you. This is coming from my kind of wrestling podcast nerddom, it's like wanting to know you better as a human who talks about wrestling and podcasts. You strike me as kind of the Ian McKay style straight edge. Are you, or do you currently not imbibe of any alcohol or drugs?
Yep, I started claiming straight edge when I was 11 years old. Mainly as in a response to my skate punk friends saying, "What the fuck? You won't smoke weed? What are you, straight edge?" And me saying, "Sure, I guess." I sit here as 34. I've never had a sip of alcohol in my life, never smoked a cigarette, never smoked weed, none of the above. Of course, I've also been a rabid drug legalization activist that whole time, or most of that whole time too. Yeah. So that always throws people off a little bit. But yeah, I am in fact straight edge.
Yeah, you just strike me as the person who has, like I said, the Ian McKay argument of I just don't have time. It's not a political thing. It's just not. I have no time for it myself.
Yeah, to me, it's not. I don't see it as a movement. When I was growing up, straight edge was really, really huge in the latter half of the '90s, starting really in the middle of the '90s, the latter half, and it was a really, really, really big thing. A lot of people saw it as frankly, as a weird ideological movement. It's interesting to note that of the dozens of people that were friends of mine, and many of them still are my friends, growing up who were straight edge in the '90s, and most of whom did see it as the movement, the only one who's still straight edge today is me, who never saw it as a movement. So I think that's telling.
Yeah, no, exactly. It was your personal choice. It wasn't about telling other people this is who I am, and that's why it sticks. So then the other wrestling nerddom thing is, I guess, I don't know. Do we want to do this Speedball Omega conversation, or do you want to just tell me your thoughts on it? I don't even know.
I'll give you a cliff notes on Speedball Omega. So
okay.
For people listening to this don't know, Timothy asked me about this match
because I'm a huge Omega fan.
On Twitter, I guess it was maybe a week ago.
Yeah, probably.
And I did have a chance to see it. I saw All-Star Weekend. I saw the PWG shows, which I thought were not very good, frankly.
Did you watch both?
Yes, I did. And
Yeah, I think Speedball Omega was the match of both shows. Best match of all three shows. Or all two shows.
I can't argue with that off the top of my head. I can't think of anything better. It was I thought, a very good match. Kind of an interesting take, because I've always argued that Speedball Mike Bailey, is like the best PWG style worker, in the sense that he's really great at these sort of burst of energy, high octane wrestling matches that are built around completely capturing the crowd through your crazy spots and doing just enough selling to not go off the rails entirely. Like, I think he's pretty much a genius, like a savant at that style. Omega, I have no use for typically. But I actually thought he was better than Bailey in this match. In terms of, a lot of people criticized the chainsaw spot where the chainsaw got crowd surfed or thrown into the ring, the plastic chainsaw or whatever. I thought in the moment that actually worked.
Can I add? I'm sorry, just to add in really quickly, just for anyone who's upset about the chainsaw spot, which I called before the match started, that would be the thing that would piss people off. Just so everyone knows, I sold that guy the ticket that he had. So if anyone's upset that there was a chainsaw in that match, come talk to me.
I thought they did a really good job sort of playing with the comedic PWG tropes without the match falling down the well into outright horse shit. Because lately, a lot of the PWG stuff has, in my opinion, been basically Chikara for people with alcohol problems. Like, it's gone too far into the realm of comedy. This match had that one spot, but I thought it was really, really well done. And I don't think it was outlandish, and it actually gave Bailey an excuse to sell something for longer than normal. I thought the leg work in the match was really, really good. My biggest criticism of the match was actually that Speedball didn't sell his leg enough down the stretch. I thought that hurt the match more than anything else, more than anything that Omega did. Having said that, and speaking more broadly about Omega, I didn't see the Ring of Honor pay-per-view last night as we record this, but I've watched him in New Japan pretty regularly over the last few weeks. And I think this idea that some people have that he's going to be super serious now that he's a main eventer there. I mean, he's basically doing a New Day tribute act. I mean, that's basically what him and the Young Bucks are doing now. They're so anybody who has any ideas that we're going to get a super serious Kenny Omega needs to shelve them because that's not going to happen.
Well, my talking point recently has been that Kenny Omega has not changed one bit to fit professional wrestling. Professional wrestling has changed now to where it fits Kenny Omega. And I think Kenny Omega is going to be a breakout star this next year as one of the top guys. And it's going to be being the same Kenny Omega that he's been for the past fucking almost 10 years. Like, he's not going to be more serious. He's going to do the same thing, but people are just, this is what people like. The more mainstream wrestling crowds like what he does more than they used to.
I think that as wrestling, I tweeted this out last week when I was talking about the Bucks and Omega's act. Regardless of how I personally feel about the act, I think the sort of millennial culture that's based around YouTube stars and animated GIFs is very well geared toward somebody like a Kenny Omega and the Young Bucks.
Yeah, exactly.
That is really, and I do think people who don't see that are kidding themselves, even if they don't like it. It's really, I think, disingenuous to pretend like there's not an audience for that when there clearly is.
All right. Well, I guess that's it. I mean, where I stand right now, Kenny Omega versus Tanahashi from New Beginning and Nagai is my match of the year. I obviously say that when we're not through February yet, but I think that's the best match that's happened in the past 2 months. So
I liked it a lot.
Yeah, that's where I'm at with Kenny Omega. I've always been a huge fan. So I wanted to hear your opinion because I knew that you were specifically Speedball in PWG fan, and I'm a huge Kenny Omega fan, and I know that you necessarily aren't a fan of his. So I just wanted to know how the other side sees it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I got to tell you, Omega's had a couple of matches that I've really liked this year, his performances. He's had some others that I haven't liked, but, that Tanahashi match and the Bailey match I thought were really good performances from him. I did not care for the Ospreay match at all, but, that's okay. He's not going to hit a home run every night.
Well, and I mean, a lot of people give shit to Ospreay, so that's fair.
He's all right.
He's fine for what he does. I like him a lot because I put a huge premium on watching people grow, and Ospreay is very much a guy who's growing right now.
Yeah, I said last night to I was text messaging a friend of mine about Progress, who said I was being unnecessarily harsh on Progress, which is weird because I'm kind of indifferent to Progress. But my what I said to him was that I thought Osprey had the boy next door good looks that you ideally want out of a star. He's got a lot of nice spots, but he comes across to me like an unpolished version of Jason Cross from Wildside, and I sort of stick by that. I think he's a guy that feels like a really big star now, but I'm not convinced that he's going to be in another 2 years. I hope I'm wrong, because wrestling needs more guys to break out. So we'll see.
I intentionally nominated him so he could be my number 100 on the greatest wrestler ever ballot, just so I can rub it in your face in 3 years when he is a big star that he was on my ballot. But no, I mean, I can't argue with the idea that he is kind of an unpolished Did you say Jason Cross?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, no, I can definitely see that because he's good. I think his promos are a little bit better than people give him credit for because he doesn't do a lot of them, but he's nothing special. But either way, I mean, he's nothing amazing yet. Either way, Dylan, what do you have to plug, I guess? What do you want to plug?
I'll make it quick because we've gone way longer than probably either of you wanted to. But
I don't mind at this point. I'm about you.
Plus, I haven't eaten today, so I should probably get some food. Well, first of all, you can follow me on Twitter at Dylan Waco. That's DYLANWACO. I always spell that because people don't know how to spell Dylan for some reason. I am a semi-regular reviewer over at WrestlingWithWords.com. I am the co-host of the Irregular Wrestling Culture podcast over at the PWO-PTBN podcast network. I'm a pretty regular guest on a variety of different shows. I'm a semi-regular guest on the Talking Sheet midweek show. I'll be back this week for that.
I have to rub it in your face that I got to hang out with Celia in real life, and you haven't.
I'm really upset about that. And see, I think this tells you all you need to know about me. I think a lot of the creepy hardcore wrestling fans would be upset that you got to hang out with Celia. And I love Celia. She's awesome. I'm more upset that you got to hang out with my boy Hugh. That's really sad to me.
Yeah, well, I mean, if I'm honest, I only said Celia because I didn't want to come across as sexist. But yeah, I knew that you would care more about Hugh.
So, yes, I am upset about that. But maybe I can make that happen myself sooner rather than later. And, of course, I am also the leading political hit theorist regarding the political hit on Roman Reigns carried out by Triple H, which hopefully I'll have a long form piece about up somewhere pretty soon. So just follow me on Twitter to keep up on that.
Yeah, and when that's up, that'll definitely be linked on our Twitter for sure because that's something I'm into as well. All right. Well, Adrian, thank you so much for being in the background of this episode.
Oh, thank you.
And
guys.
Anyone listening to this already knows our stuff. So, yeah, that's it. Thanks,
awesome.
Dylan.
Thanks, Dylan.
Thank you, guys.